Good morning, welcome to revision session number 10. We're going to talk today about the cardiac cycle, the flow of blood through the heart. Now, it's very important that before you take part in the session, you've definitely looked at session number 3, revision session number 3, which was the conduction system and cardiac control. These two sessions together form a complete understanding for ASP of the heart. So please have a look at that if you haven't already. So let's make a start for those of you that have seen that in advance. Well, we're looking today at how blood flows through, into and out of the heart. Now we're going to start at the start, which sounds obvious, but we're interested in these two features here, the vena cava. Now, of course, we know that deoxygenated blood returns to the right atrium from these two large veins, the superior from the upper body, the inferior from the lower body. We then get an accumulation of blood in the right atrium, that blood being deoxygenated, and that is during atrial diastole. Remember, diastole means relaxation or filling. So we get atrial diastole, the right atrium fills with blood, and as the SI node emits an impulse, that atrium is contracted and forces blood down into the right ventricle. Now, when the atria together contract because of the sinoatrial node impulse, we call this atrial systole. So far we've looked at atrial, which refers to both atria, and we've looked at notions of systole, contraction, and diastole, relaxation. Of course, during diastole we have filling, and during systole we have emptying. So at this point, the right atrium, it contracts, it goes through systole, and then it empties, and as a result, the right ventricle fills. So we get ventricular diastole at this point, ventricular filling. Of course, we then have the impulse from the SA node re-emitted by the AV node. That causes ventricular systole. And that ventricular systole forces blood up and out of the right ventricle, out past the semilunar valves, which then go into the entry to the left and right pulmonary artery, taking blood deoxygenated up to the lung, where it returns, as we see here, via the pulmonary veins, which then, of course, enter the left atrium. And we go through the process again. Just as the right atrium contracted, so does the left atrium. We have atrial systole, and then the blood that's returned from the lungs is passed down into the left ventricle. Much stronger chamber, this time much thicker myocardial heart wall, and we get a much more powerful contraction. Ventricular systole, of course, it forces blood up and out in this direction, which allows the now oxygenated blood to leave the aorta. So therefore we have ventricular systole, and we have the oxygenated blood leaving the left ventricle to travel around the rest of the body. It does exactly that, and of course it returns back to our inferior and our superior vena cava, which of course completes our cycle. We have a summary of that cycle down here. Right atrium, blood passes through the tricuspid valve, which is the valve between the right atrium and the right ventricle. That takes place during atrial systole. From the right ventricle, blood then leaves via ventricular systole and leaves via the pulmonary arteries to the lungs, back to the heart and the left atrium via the pulmonary vein. Left atrium then goes through atrial systole, atrial contraction, and we have blood being forced through the bicuspid valve, this time into the left ventricle. We then experience ventricular systole, and blood is passed through the aortic semilunar valve and out of the aorta. And finally for today, we're going to look at the notion of ventricular filling. And what we're going to have a look at here is that when the ventricles go through a period of diastole or relaxation, of course, both the right and the left ventricles, they fill with blood. And that is in that, as I said a moment ago, that diastole phase. Now, the quantity of that blood is what we call the SD V. And we call that the start diastolic volume. Okay? So at this point, we have a certain quantity of blood, which, of course, has been passed down into the ventricles from the atria. When, however, we experience ventricular systole or ventricular filling, that blood is ejected. And now we have a much smaller quantity of blood. And we call this the end systolic volume. The end of the systole, the volume of blood which remains in the ventricles. And of course, if we take our SDV and we take away our end systolic volume, it gives us the actual quantity of blood that is passed out of the heart. Now you might think, well, I know what that's called already, James. That's called stroke volume. And you'd be absolutely right. However, we also call the quantity or the fraction of blood which is being ejected the ejection fraction, and it's a good term you can use in your exam. What is the fraction or the proportion of blood that is passed down into the ventricles which is actually emitted or pumped out by the ventricles? And we call that the ejection fraction. And of course, the nearer that ejection fraction is to 1, the fitter or the stronger our heart is. Thank you for listening today, guys. Good luck with your revision, and should you have any feedback for me, please feel free to get in touch. Thank you. I'm going to add one point to the session today. Those of you that are very bright out there will have known I've made a little mistake, and it's not SDV, but it's actually EDV. So it's end diastolic volume rather than start diastolic volume. So end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume equals our ejection fraction. Sorry for confusing you on that one, but the end of the diastolic phase in the ventricles, the relaxation phase of the ventricles, we have that larger volume, as I said before, up there somewhere, and then our end systolic volume is how much was left at the end of contraction. And there we go, just in there. And the EDV minus the ESV is the ejection fraction. Thank you. Take care.